every time a by-election happens in a Tory-held seat in the next 5 years, we need to ensure that whoever's elected is a committed anti-Tory candidate. We need to whittle away that Tory majority until we can vote them out in a vote of no confidence, bring forth an early election and get a change of government. I mean, I don't like the Labour Party. I used to be in them. I became thoroughly despairing at how right-wing, how anti-democratic they were, frankly. But even they'd be a step up from what we have now. So I think we need, electorally going forward, is almost a popular front, a committed move by all electoral parties that whenever a by-election comes up, we put forward a candidate committed to opposing the Tories, committed to implementing some form of electoral reform. There's a few events on the horizon now, actually, that I wonder that will affect what we do. Who wins the leadership elections in the Labour and the Lib Dems? Who's open to political pluralism rather than tribalism? And ideas for discussion, I guess, once we open this to the floor, which I hope we do. How do we overcome tribalism? Because that's a huge problem in political movements. My party's better than yours, my party has all the answers, my faction is following the right from the ideological dogma. You've probably heard it before in many panel discussions. How do we build a genuinely pluralistic movement that builds a better society for all of us? And how do we frame an anti-Tory movement in a positive terms? It isn't just a, we don't like that. How do we frame it so, we want a better society? That's all I have to say, really.
I'll be as quick as I can. The context that we have at the moment is weird. We actually are in a situation of political stagnation rather than a massive Tory swing. Like, we've got the numbers in front of me here. In 2010, the Tories got 36.1% of the vote. In this election, they got 36.9% of the vote. Now, all that's happened, the Tories haven't had a huge swing in their favour. In essence, the Lib Dems, going into government with the Tories, who were previously in opposition to the Tories, and a lot of seats from the southwest of England have collapsed. And now the Tories have basically absorbed all of those different seats and just about peaked over the majority that they need to get into a government. What this means is that we're not actively fighting a society which seems to want to hurt itself through conservative governments, but instead it just means that we have a political system which is completely unable to represent how politics is done in this country anymore. And you can see that in how the Labour Party, its vote share went up. It went up by 1.6%, and its seats went down horribly. It's got the lowest seats it's had in decades. But what we've also seen is the rise of anti-establishment parties from both the left and right, capitalising on the political stagnation which is going on. The term I've heard used is a legitimacy crisis, and I think it's entirely true, because political parties now, at least the mainstream ones, are completely wedded to the economic circumstances which go on. We no longer have any enforcement or control over what happens to us. Someone in America has an investment problem. We're cutting jobs here, like housing firm farts, and people are dying in this country. It's ridiculous because we have no way of meaningfully applying what we want democratically anymore, and that's being manifested. Now, what we see is what I found surprising is actually how ripe the ground is at the moment for a Tory government, and yet how they've not actually done very well. They've got huge financial backing, more than any other political party out there. They've got the majority of the print media, the BBC, and its very dubious interpretation of non-bias has been massively putting forward conservative candidates on its spokesman's list. Even in The Guardian today, I saw an article speaking about how trade union activity in the railways is going to harm the country, with lots of comments from the business leaders about how bad it is for business, but nothing from the union officials and workers about why it's important that people support themselves for a better wage. And this is the problem, and yet with all of these biases and inbuilt systemic problems, they've still done really badly comparatively to historical circumstances. So the question for us now is, we know what's going on with this. We can target ourselves if we want to in terms of electoral strategy. Because first past the post is terrible for representation, but actually, like the SNP have done, you can do very well out of a very small share of the vote if you know how to apply it. The thing with electoral strategy and this sort of thing is I don't think it's just about the government anymore. I think we're at a point of international finance, meaning that it's incredibly difficult for you even see radical groups like Syriza in Greece struggling to deal with the international circumstances of their financial problems. So what we're going to have at the moment is far more radical action taken on the ground. But to do that, we need to start building capacity. And to build capacity, we've got to have something to stand for, because at the moment, All we're doing is going down to London every 4 years, marching around in a circle and doing nothing. We're not actually engaging with our communities at all. We don't know what our neighbours' problems are, but instead we're travelling halfway across the country to go protest at someone else's demo rather than dealing with our own stuff. Now, this is what the problem that the trade unions are facing as well. And I don't know how true this is, but from my perspective, most people at work don't think the unions are very good. They think the unions are stultified. They're hampered by the government legislation. The Tories are going to come down even harder on the next unions that come up. So the question is, if we can't see the unions support themselves, what can we do to help workers and help vulnerable people right here on the ground now? And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the strategies and tactics we can do. All of us in this room can go back and not feel like we're just a cog in a political machine somewhere else. We're actively engaging in our communities, looking after people who are vulnerable. Like myself, I've had to deal with huge amounts of benefit problems for the past several years. One of the reasons I was late is because I had to get someone to come down here to the bus fare to get in. And that's a recurring problem for a lot of people. So I'll hopefully elaborate a bit more on that. But I think it's not as bad as it seems, but now is the time that we've really got to start, because if we don't, we're going to lose out. So yeah, that's my point.
All right, well, because I'm actually going to be speaking from a kind of trade union perspective, and so a lot of what I've got to say isn't really so much about the election. It really is more on the side of what is to be done. As well, I'm involved with the UCU. It's actually not affiliated to any political party, and I'm actually not a member of any political party myself. So this is why I can't really comment so much on the election. But I'll offer a couple of reflections, and the first is that I would argue that, that basically the Tories and UKIP, and to a certain extent Labour as well, unfortunately, has, there's been a kind of divisive rhetoric, and which I would argue is the kind of striver versus grounder rhetoric, that's really, it kind of works a lot more when we're kind of isolated and scared, because then when we're isolated and scared, then it's kind of a lot more tempting for us to feel that that maybe we're not going to be affected ourselves if we keep our heads down and don't rock the boat, we're going to be fine. Or that, we're strivers and our neighbours are skivers because they're out of work, or because they're disabled, or they're single parents, or they speak with a foreign accent, or skin color, or have a different religion, and so on. And that's the kind of toxic, nature of the debate that we've been seeing, and that has done a lot of damage, I would say. But I think it's done a lot of damage because, I think a lot of us have been isolated and scared. And one of the reasons why we've been isolated and scared has been the erosion of the social movement infrastructure. I would agree that I think unions are in a difficult place, and they I've been in the process of trying to rebuild a branch that was basically dysfunctional for many years. So I think the erosion of that kind of social movement infrastructure has led to us feeling more isolated and scared. But I don't think it's only unions. I hear what you were saying before about anti-racist organizations being institutionalized. Being sort of, branches of electoral politics, or the kind of business empowerment kind of approach. So I think the kind of institutionalization, erosion of social movement organizations makes it much easier to feel that we're isolated and scared, and it makes that rhetoric much easier to work, I would say. Now, I think kind of after the election, I was kind of quite disappointed too, and I think we were a bit shocked because the polls said something else would happen. But after sort of seeing the debate after the election, I really actually, it made me really quite cynical about electoral politics, to be honest. Because, there's this idea of, there's all that talk of aspiration, which I found is frankly vacuous. Or this kind of, this idea of which kind of machine politician has the X factor. And that's just, and I found that actually disempowering, because that put me in a position of being kind of like a passive spectator. Or it was like I was watching sports or something like that, or betting on who's going to win, but it's not about actually doing anything. So this is where I actually think we really need to look at what do we do on the ground, how do we rebuild the social movement infrastructure so people aren't isolated and scared, we're a better place to resist whatever's coming, but whether it's the Tories or whether it's another government, basically. But I'll say more on the kind of what is to be done side. That's just a few thoughts I had on the election.
Well, I hate to deflate people even further, but I think it's worse than what we've already heard, unfortunately. I'll come to that in a moment. Coming to the election itself, I actually obviously found it an incredibly depressing experience watching the results trickle in. But I actually had fun on the night, which is great. I'm an anarchist, and I normally either vote in a kind of protest way, or I scribble something on my ballot paper. But on this occasion, I actually stood in the constituency of Croydon South on a ticket of "Don't vote for me," and still got 65 votes. So, you know, it was quite an exciting night. But one of the exciting things about it was, you know, as a total politics geek, seeing the count in action and living through that experience was a lot of fun. And having running battles as the count was taking place with the Tory and his supporters was a great deal of fun as well. And I got to do a speech at the declaration where the Tory was enthroned, and we all knew he was going to win anyway. And it's a guy called Chris Philp. You might want to remember the name. He's a new MP, but I think we're going to hear a lot about him in the decades to come. I think he's going to become a negative part of our lives, unfortunately. He's got a lot of potential. And at the declaration, I was thinking, what kind of speech can I possibly say? What do I say to people now, not thinking that we were going to have a Tory majority? And here's this Tory standing in front of me, boasting and looking very excited about it. And he began by thanking the Metropolitan Police, and I'd spent all morning on election day in court with a friend who was put up for trial on trumped-up charges. She had set fire to an effigy of Boris Johnson on bonfire night. And the Crown Prosecution Service had said that that's a terrible thing to do. And they tried to fit her up for it. And over the course of that morning, they had to keep changing the charges, because of course it isn't illegal to set fire to an effigy on bonfire night. The whole country's bloody doing it. And the case was eventually thrown out. But just hearing that thanks for the Metropolitan Police, and knowing that we have a Metropolitan Police force that can and has and does execute people in broad daylight and get away with it, really got me angry. And so when I stood up to the microphone, I just let rip, and I said that what we need is civil disobedience. We need people on the streets. We need it immediately. We needed it that day or the day later, and sure enough, on the Saturday I was able to go to Whitehall, and we've seen headlines about thuggery and riots, and all I saw that day was the police trying to hit people and trying to kettle people. But that is actually what we need. We need direct action. We need people to be hitting the streets. We don't need A to B marches, that's for sure. We need people to be working in their communities. We've actually had a lot of community action going on, and it works. We've seen, well, it works sometimes. We need to find out why it works sometimes and build on that. We've seen campaigns like the Focus E15 Mums in London and the Aylesbury estate in London. And I mean, London is a massive housing issue at the moment. So we've seen a lot of campaigns like that. But of course I was depressed at the election, but there's some hope here. The majority is very small. When John Major's government came in 1992, it was larger, and it had so much trouble getting legislation through. He even had to face a leadership challenge, and Europe is still an issue that splits the Tories. And I think we need to get inside their heads. They talk of control such a lot. They talk about control. It's immigration, it's welfare, it's benefits, it's the deficit, it's austerity. They must feel that this world is chaotic. And they tell us it all the time, don't they? They tell us it's a dangerous world. They tell us to be scared, and that's why they feel that they need to control things. But, of course, they don't control the things that scare us. They don't control the fact that we need food banks. They don't control our rents or our mortgage repayments. They don't control our NHS services to the extent that they provide them in any meaningful sense anymore. Instead, they're hiving them off to their mates. So when they talk about control, it is us that they want to control, which means they actually fear us, doesn't it? And they should fear us, and we should make them fear us. But that means that we have got to get organised. We have got to do things that work. And the thing that always works, ultimately, is direct action. It's how we got the things that we cherish. It's how we got human rights. It's how we got the vote in the first place, by actually hitting the streets and fighting for it. And I fear that things are so much worse than what we've heard already because of some of the plans that they have, specifically the plans to curtail strike action and the plans that they have on extremism. When our Prime Minister can tell us that it's no longer the case that the police will only interfere in your lives if you're breaking the law, then that means that they want to stop dissent. That means that potentially events like this might not include the people that you have in front of you now, because maybe they will be prevented from attending. It might mean that someone like Len McCluskey, who in previous times has come out every 6 months and called for civil disobedience, might just shut his trap a bit because he'd be scared to say such things. Not that he ever actually gets involved with civil disobedience, but he does like to call for it. So we have to be careful about those laws coming into place where the authorities will try to shut us down and shut us up, because that is the ultimate chilling effect on our democracy, if we can call it that anymore.
I think I'd like to open it up to the floor. So if we might, there you go, there's a hand. We'll take Abu, and then we'll take my man, and then maybe one more. Anyone else got a question? I'm going to take my man here, and then I'll come back there. So, Abu?
Interesting talk there. I mean, I was wondering if any of the panelists have any thoughts or opinions on the CTS, the PREVENT program, the surveillance of Muslims, the harassment of Muslims, the arrest, imprisonment, basically the repression that Muslims are facing in this country.
Okay, I'm going to take them in threes. Is that all right? So, yeah.
Okay, I want to raise 3 points. First one is the issue of leadership. In my opinion, Ben is right. We have seen a period of political stagnation, and part of that is because there hasn't been a leadership that actually challenged the dominant ideas that the state has put forward. The austerity agenda has largely gone unquestioned. The union leaders have not dealt with it. The Labour Party has colluded with that, and the left have tried to mobilise, but they haven't got a voice that is effective. Secondly, I'm all for community work. I believe we have to build from the root upwards, but I'm fearful that a lot of what I hear from an array of views to the left of centre are still transfixed by electoralism. It's still talking about power as if power is only in Westminster. That is not the case. That is a myth the ruling classes want us to buy into. Power is what we do, not what they do, but what we do and how we want to shift that power relation. So let's get that straight, okay? And lastly, I think what we need to do is not build a popular front. I get nervous when I hear that phraseology, but I do think it's about building social movement around clear demand, transitional demand that can mobilise community, that can get action and put pressure on this government.
Okay, and then my man. Who was my man? Oh, my man. There you.
Someone mentioned the unrepresentativeness of the voting system.
Because we're recording it, so I can't need to.
Somebody mentioned the unrepresentativeness of the voting system earlier on, and like I've heard this mentioned like even on like daily politics on BBC. So it's something that's like out there, sort of amongst mainstream ideas kind of thing. And something else that I have heard mentioned as like a mainstream thing that's out there is this idea of like this new British Constitution idea. Now I thought that was kind of a bit wet or ridiculous or whatever, but like yesterday I found out that in America they've won, in Los Angeles, they've won $15 an hour minimum wage. And I thought about it and I thought, well, that shows then that through organisation, that sort of political legal battle for demands, as long as the demands are there, it can be won if there's enough organisation there. And this really is like the sector of the workforce. It should be the most difficult to organise. I mean, you're a precarious worker, you're on a 0-hour contract, you're doing a job where you're basically told implicitly or explicitly. Sometimes when you do these jobs, you're told, you can be replaced at any time you want. You're an unskilled worker. There's people, the dole queue's 2 miles long. Anybody can take your job. And I was wondering what people think about the idea of like that sort of political legal battle, direct action, sort of this new constitution, a sort of set of demands like universal basic income sort of thing, and like a set of demands. It's like a demand package where taken together it's more that they can offer, it's more that they can actually, because I mean that's kind of the way it's been done from what I've understood. It's kind of like you demand, you demand more than they can actually give you. So it's like universal basic income and a 30-hour work week, something like that, and like try and deal with that sort of thing.
Okay. You want me to use the mic? Yeah. I don't mind using the mic. Okay, so what we're going to do is if people can respond to those questions, you don't have to respond to all of them if you don't, and as with all panel, just because you're on a panel doesn't mean you've got to say something. If you feel someone's covered it, just move on, and we'll deal with some more questions, yeah?
I'd like to respond to what you
Yeah, okay. I'm all for democracy, but...
Can you hear me without?
No, because we're recording it.
Oh, right, yeah.
Is that on? Wait it.
Shall I speak loud? I'm not going to say them.
I think this lady here already addressed why people might not. God, this is really off-putting with the mic. About the whole people don't feel they can speak up in their trade unions or otherwise because they're disposable. So you were saying that that's incredibly disempowering as well, but.
I would argue that it is a task of trade unions to organise and mobilise people in that kind of situation. I think where I'm going to be critical of unions, and I'm also speaking on someone who was on kind of temporary contracts. I mean, not the kinds of jobs you're talking about, thankfully. Is that I've noticed that sometimes there's a tendency for to give the impression that you have to have worked someplace for 20 years to have the right to be involved. I've seen employment legislation being referred to in this kind of quite arcane, kind of geeky way that makes it harder for new activists, and this idea that it's not really for people like that. And I think that's what really needs to be challenged. And I think that's where I think hopefully that. But there are people out there who are trying to challenge that. I do know, and as well. I think another place I'd be.
Sorry. I heard you ask a question about the universal basic income. My friend is actually campaigning and working very hard on the legislation and everything to do with that. I don't know much about it. I don't know if it's something that only big companies are working on, or if it's an actual demand that we can make as a unified front. Sorry, dude. But I think that would be great, a basic universal income that people can actually survive on. Thank you.
should I continue or shall I pass it on to somebody else? Well, I was just going to say, so I think that it's really, I think if unions are to survive, as viable organizations, it's really, really crucial that it's sort of dealing with people in kind of precarious work situations. But I think it's also really important to think about the relation between work and benefits. And this is why, I strongly support what you suggested about a universal income, because if you're not worried that if you lose your job, you're going to end up in this destitute situation, you might be sanctioned. If you're not so worried that you're going to, that you might be destitute, then you won't feel so scared in your job. So this is where I think, we do need to think about these things as related. I won't use that phrase joined up thinking, but you know what I mean. I don't know if anyone else wants to respond.
One of the things we've got to remember when it comes to trade unions is the way that they operate. And the way that they operate with regards to the TUC is that there's a specific link to the Labour Party. And the unions get their biggest help when there's a Labour government. So the chances of getting things pushed through for workers are obviously different when the Tories are in power than when Labour is in power. But the other thing we have to remember with regards to the Labour Party is that it is currently a neoliberal party. And if it had won the election, it would be pursuing an agenda of austerity, just not austerity as bad as the Tories. So you have to think about what the Labour Party's done. And one of the most recent things that they did in terms of workers' rights is that they enhanced the role of employment tribunals. And what employment tribunals mean is that they individualise, not collectivise struggle. They individualise struggle. So as a union rep, what I found when I was a trade union activist was that people came to me wanting help with their personal case, not necessarily something that we could work on collectively. And so, I mean, and that was a victory for a neoliberal agenda. It was a victory that then allowed the Tories to bring in higher fees for tribunal cases, and it makes the struggle harder. What we need in our trade unions is to push them back towards collectivising struggle and making sure that that becomes the agenda. And if that becomes the agenda in the Labour Party, then fine. If it just becomes our agenda as a movement, then that is perfect. And I just want to say something on leadership as well. I mean, I think we've got to stop looking towards others to become the leaders. We're all leaders. Everyone here is a leader, and everyone's got the potential. We pass the baton around for people who are comfortable to do whatever they want to do, and we back them up. And that is the way that we should have our movement. It doesn't need people to be put on a pedestal so they can be shot down. We need to stick together and allow people who have the skills to do certain things to do those things, and for others to do things at different times. And I think that is a perfect model of leadership.
Cheers. I'm going to be fairly blunt here, because this is my thinking for quite a while. All of the best policy ideas and thoughts on changing legislation and everything can only occur if we have power, and we have to be strong enough to make these things. It's a problem I have in the left generally, where we end up talking about the ideal society that we want, but we have very little limited mechanisms to even sort out the problems of lighting around the corner, let alone the transnational problems of global capital. Now, my current thinking is what I wrote here wasn't going to be about kind of the bigger issues. It's going to be about what we can do here right now, all of us in this room, and how we can think about how we can apply our efforts in a way which both isn't detrimental to ourselves, but also means that what we've done is worthwhile and builds up power against the stuff that's going to come, because that's what we need. Everything that I've seen so far is all about the methods of how we do it, but currently I'm at the point where we're in a city of 1 million people, and I've spoken to the tiniest proportion of it. I don't know what people think politically. Most of my campaigning electorally is done not on the basis that I particularly want a party to win, but because I need to know what people on the ground think. And if I know what people on the ground think, then I'm able to present arguments that will win them over, so they'll actually want to come out and deal with the stuff that's going to hurt us. Because at the moment, all that's going to happen is the way the neoliberal system is working there. We'll see services degrade, we'll see people suffering, and we're very good at creating an image of scarcity where there is none. We're not scarce, we're very rich, we're very productive when we need to be, but it's presented like that, and we're going to be forced to fight amongst ourselves. And what you find on the doorstep is people think it's immigrants, they think it's benefit scroungers, they think it's everyone else other than the people who did the problem. And we can only challenge that. We can't just go up to them and lecture them and go, no, all of your views are wrong, because they've come to the conclusions over the course of years and years of media information. The only way we can do it is to instead challenge by action. And that means when people are suffering, they have to see someone of us on the left, hopefully, going out there and saying, okay, we'll directly help you with this. I'm not going to just talk to you because talk is cheap. I'm going to help you deal with the problem with your food. I'm going to help you deal with the problems with your benefits claim. I'm going to help resist when the immigration officers come and start raiding your houses. We're going to be there with the rest of the community stopping it, because that's the only way we're going to get any power to do anything about this. Now, I want to see a universal basic income. To be honest, I'd like to see a kind of like libertarian communist utopia. But right now, I want to see us being able to make the barest possible difference with the least exertion of power possible. Because we're all working, we're all tired, we're all scared, and we have to be able to do stuff which not only supports other people, but supports ourselves as well. So, for instance, I will be very political, but the problem I have is charities are occupying this space which should be political. And that's why I'm saying this stuff now. Like, if you see food bank distributions, it's done as a charity. Now, the government's created legislation to explicitly stop charities from making political statements. You go to a charity and all they're making you do is work for free to get people fed, and they can't feed themselves, and you're not allowed to do anything about that. Well, I say, actually, we give people food, and we speak to them, and we say, okay, help us get more food to people, but also resist the kind of policies which are making this occur. On all the points that people have brought up, there's a whole load of stuff. First past the post is a bad system. But even if we had the best proportional representation ever, it's not going to change a great deal while we don't have proper autonomous working class power able to resist international finance. If we don't have that power, which is what we had when we created the welfare state, we had a militarised working class who had been fighting in a war for several years and were like, we need a better life than this, and if we don't get it, we're going to execute you. And so they thought, okay, actually, we'll make hospitals free, we'll give people housing, and we'll give people what they need. Whereas while it stands like now, we've got to start on the very basic, the most basic point of rebuilding this stuff. We can't talk big visions anymore. We've got to start on our streets. We've got to talk to our neighbours and find out what the issues are that affect them and explain to them over the course of years, if it takes it, decades, that these problems are caused by this economic system and this political class who do all of this stuff. And by helping us do stuff like food distribution, like cleaning up a street, helping old people, imagine an occupation undertaken by a group of elderly people. It would be a propaganda coup for us, because we would know that we've finally reached out beyond the bases of the left, of the intellectuals and the academics and the disgruntled, and finally reached out to represent and make wider society want to join us. And I think that's where we have to be aiming right now. Us, here and now, in this room, thinking about our lives, on our streets and our workplaces, or where we can direct the best effort possible to disrupt this shit that happens. So that's where I'm going to finish. Thank you.
Do you reckon I can top that? Yeah, just to pick up on a few comments, because so much of what I agree has already been said. In terms of what, as Abu was saying, about Islamophobic policy, Islamophobic political discourse, I mean, that's just one facet of some of the horror that's going to be coming forward in the next 5 years. So it's essential we challenge that, really. We challenge the discourses behind that. The divide and rule rhetoric, the pointing at an other that's been identified as outside the cultural mainstream and saying, look, that's the root of your problem. It is like what Ben was saying, really, about diverting the root causes, diverting the blame for the root causes of economic problems to a social group, because it's an easy diversion. In terms of the question about leadership, and again, that's a question of needing not just political leadership, but organisations that are able and willing to challenge the sort of dominant political narratives, the overwhelming sort of consensus, as it is in the media, that this is the way things are, this is the only way things can possibly be, these are the only policies which aren't radical or extreme, this is your choice within these very narrow parameters. And in terms of, sure, electoral strategy isn't the be-all and end-all. I chose to focus on it just so so we could all talk about something slightly different, I guess, in our openings. What you need is both electoral strategy and protest and direct action sort of working together in harmony. You want to elect people so they're in the room to push for the decisions that you want, but you also want a hell of a lot of people outside the room being very vocal and very angry and making sure, essentially keeping the people who are elected honest. And in terms of what Martin was saying about basic income, to be honest, that's as near as to a silver bullet in terms of policies you can get for inequality, and it's something I'll always push for. And I very much like this idea of transitional demands.
Yeah, just to build on the points that are made about the TTS bill, one thing that we haven't actually addressed is the fact that a lot of anti-racist, anti-fascist organisations and their failures. So UAF, for example, actually relies on massive donations from trade unions and political parties, but what it actually doesn't have is grassroots links the way groups did in the 1970s, like the Asian youth movement, and that's what we need to go back to. I'm hearing a lot of, we need to go back to the community, we need to, cultivate these groups and this organisation, these movements. And these movements do exist, for example, for the BME community anyway. You've got the London Black Revolutionaries, you've got the Black Students Campaign, and we need to support these organisations. We need to move away from relying on state funding, because that waters down politics, and that makes organisations reluctant to criticise the state. So what we actually have to go back to is our roots. And we have these organisations, we just need to develop them, we need to support them, because we can't rely on anyone else. Because when push comes to shove, we're on our own. And we've seen that within the student movement, when people are willing to stand up to racism and Islamophobia, you'll find that you're on your own. And even those, white, left, unity groups that you kind of thought had your back tend to, leave you on your own. So that's what we need. We need our own strong movements that are self-reliant and self-led. So that's what I'd say.
But I think also what we need to do is we need to contend with the new forms of racism, such as for example, towards Eastern Europeans, given that the talk of the EU referendum, for example, and we need to think, and as well, kind of xenophobia behind, I think a lot of this government policies, but unfortunately, Labour's, anti-immigration bugs. So I think that I think one of the things that these organisations are trying to build again have to do is not only about challenging racism, but also about thinking about challenging xenophobia, and also finding ways to kind of basically frame a lot of these anti-immigration policies and rhetoric as racist. This is what the organisations in the 70s did, and I think this is also what we need to do now.
Set some more questions. Oh, you got the point, right?
I think my main question is probably a bit of a Trojan horse one, a bit of a three from you. It concerns the media. A lot of the tweets I saw on 8th of May were quite sarcastic means of saying, oh, we know who's holding the real strings, it's Rupert Murdoch, ooh, boo, bad guy. But I actually think it raises potentially a more serious question in how much the media are actually influencing the whole thing. In particular regards, certainly today, there's been the story that's been circulated on the Daily Mail, whereby ostensibly the headlines are looking like they are vilifying all Filipino nurses, and it is just on the head of one psychopath, and nationality shouldn't have ever been referenced at all. Within that, the question that I have to you all really is, to what extent do you think the media really has influence, ranging from 0 to a lot? And also, what action can we as individuals take to challenge that? Because I think, honestly, it's not something that can necessarily be discounted. I think with how much funding goes into these organisations and how much instant power goes around from social media and otherwise, I think it's something that needs to be at the forefront of people's minds.
I wanted to make a bit of a point and I have a question. So a lot of people have been talking about grassroots community type organising. Well, trade unions have been doing that for 200 years. And we've won so much during that time, like the weekend, abolishing child labour laws, equal pay for women, blah, blah. If we talk about power and politics being about what kind of power we have, then as workers we have a lot actually. And we saw today just a threat of a rail strike on bank holiday. Monday has made National Rail go back to the rail unions and improve their pay offer for the rail workers. When people talk about trade unions, they talk about them like this
kind of third entity, like this other kind of being, like, oh, what are the trade unions doing about that then? You know, like, trade unions are the same as politicians, like, they're not these superheroes who are going to come in and, like, wave their magic wand. Trade unions are membership-based organisations. Trade unions will do what the members of trade unions do. So if your trade union is crap where you work, or if you don't have one, then get one, start one, become a part of one. Like, when I started working at my workplace, I joined Unison and they were useless. So I'm quite gobby and had a lot of time on my hands. So I thought I'll just do it. Like, I became a rep and got organising, and when our employer threatened to cut our wages by £4,000, then we took all out strike action for a week and they dropped the threat of that. That's how you fight austerity, like directly organising with your fellow workers and people in your community to resist the attacks on you. So if you want unions to be a grassroots, powerful force for social change, which I believe they are, then be a part of it. Like, it's hard, boring work, and everyone wants, like, the answer to getting rid of the Tories or austerity or communism or whatever, to be like, oh, well, if we just do these magic things, then it'll all be wonderful. Like, it's not, it's boring shit, tiring, hard work, but, like, you have to do it. Like, just get stuck in. If you work in a shitty cafe or council and you're all on minimum wage or 0 hours contracts, then start a meeting with your fellow workers about how you can fight that and fight for better conditions for yourselves. Sorry, that was a really long point. So my question was to the UCU, the woman from UCU. You said that you kind of started from nothing, really an active UCU branch. So I was just wondering, like, the actual practical things you did to build that up and get there.
Okay, I'm just going to take the mic around, but can I ask that we keep the language, we've got 2 kids in the back, so we keep, that's all. My only contribution to the day.
Talking about the Tories, there was an article I read yesterday or today about the new legislation that David Cameron passed about the revoking of, like, what so-called illegal immigrants have earned. So I'm not talking about the xenophobia, the toxic xenophobia around it. That is an entire part of the discussion, but the very concept of revoking someone's wages or taking away what somebody has earned, what does that mean as a concept, or what do you feel that means as a concept for, say, dissenters or organisers, or, you know, how deep, what kind of slope is this, and how deep do you feel that going?
Yeah, okay. The point that I wanted to make was specifically about media influence, and especially Rupert Murdoch. If you could actually look at all the kind of companies he owns across the world, not even just the UK, when you look at Australia, you look at America, and all of his acquisitions, or whatever you want to call them, his influence is absolutely, it's kind of eye-opening. I was researching just a couple of weeks ago, actually, after he tweeted stuff about Muslims being a cancer, and, you know, calling, you know, for all sorts of awful things to happen to Muslim communities. But what you actually will find within certain communities is the development of our own media channels and our own media platforms. So for the black community in particular, you know, you've got Black Voice, you've got Black Star, you've got newspapers, because you can't trust the media to represent your views, and you can never trust, you know, especially with the funding that it gets, and it's kind of, it's capitalism, and it wants views, so it's always going to go for, you know, what's popular. So xenophobia, that's nice. Racism, we love a bit of that. Anti-blackness, yes, let's do this. So, you know, you've got the growth, the development of these institutions that are really actually desperate for funding as well from the community. So I keep saying this, but that's what they need. They need funding, they need support. Like, a couple of years ago, there's 5 pillars for the Muslim community anyway, and it was a kind of a project that developed out of realizing that you're never going to get the media portrayal that people keep talking about. Oh, the media keeps portraying Muslims as really, you know, evil people. So, you know, certain members of the community used their initiative and created that. So you've got, you know, a self-reliant kind of platform there for Muslims to use and spread information and things like that. And that's what it ultimately comes down to. You know, If the rest of society is not giving you, or community, what you need, you have to put it on, the onus is on you to kind of do something about it. So whether it's like politicians and direct action with things like services, and especially with the media, it's up to us to kind of, you know, push forward our own narrative. But in particular, what really impresses me about America, for example, and what's happening with the murder of black people, which is, you know, nothing new, but the change of discourse, so how social media is being used to change the narrative. So when Mike Brown died, you know, you have all of these, oh, he was a thug, you know, other people have died, oh, they're criminals, but then you've got people who are using social media, especially as a tool to kind of change that discourse, change that narrative. So I stole a bottle, you know, a bottle of drink, does that mean that I deserve to die because of the colour of my skin? That sort of thing. So people are actually using more than, you know, they've realised that the media is never going to kind of help them or support their cause, so they're using alternative forms. And I think social media has seen that, especially with Ferguson and Baltimore, things like that. And maybe that's the way forward. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, to carry on the media theme, I suppose. You know, how much influence does the media have? I don't know if you can quantify it other than to say not as much as it used to have, but still far, far too much. What can we do about it? Well, I think it took a far cleverer man than a woman than myself to work that one out. Other than just not play their game, you know, challenge those narratives whenever they occur. Whenever you hear anyone saying, you know, it's benefit scroungers for this, challenge that. The fewer people that buy into that rhetoric, the less potent it is, the less those memes circulate through society. And I'd also echo what Zara was saying about you know, the importance of social media, the importance of alternative forms of media. I mean, here in Birmingham we've got Slaney Street, an alternative newspaper that's, you know, finding its way and is you know, very good so far, and hopefully will continue to grow. That's really the only way we're going to challenge these media barons. In terms of trade unions, I'd echo that again, that they're the best vehicle we've had in this country for social change. I've recently joined USDOR myself, the union for shop workers, so I'll see how that goes. In terms of the, revoking wages, yeah, that's a bizarre one from a party that 2 weeks ago was equivalent, you know, was talking about tax as if tax was stealing your wages, to then say, well, what we're going to do is steal your wages, you know, terms and conditions apply kind of thing. Yeah, it's bizarre rhetoric that, again, just needs to be challenged by politicians who have, I suppose, the nerve to go against what Rupert Murdoch likes.
Yeah. So on the basis of kind of what you said before, I think it's interesting because I think media is still holding a sway over an older generation of people who predominantly use it, and I think that's what we're seeing. As we see a younger generation of people come up who are used to interacting with people and seeing the world in a different manner, we're more able to see alternative points of view. One of the weird studies I've seen about the role of media, actually, and one of the problematic things of new media, is that in essence we're allowed to just pick and choose our communities and where we get our information from. So actually quite often, while it might seem we have more access to dissenting information and learning more stuff, we're just simply choosing the stuff we already like and keeping it floating around for us. So the difficulty is trying to get people to start to edge out of where they take their information from. And I've been doing a lot of stuff with Slaney Street, not as much as I'd like actually, but I'm a paying member of Slaney Street myself. I think the part of the process that we have to do is a combination of reflecting what people think and say, but also gradually pushing the change away from it. So not buying into a narrative, any of these narratives which are negative, but instead looking at the root causes of the problem and finding an explanation which doesn't hurt people or blame people, but instead looks at the systemic forces around it, which can be communicated clearly, hopefully more clearly than I can do it. With trade unions, actually, from my own personal experience, it's difficult because I push everyone I know who's working or who's not working or is a student to be involved in their union. My student union was one of the most dreadful experiences I ever had in my life, to the point where I worked very hard to make it something good. I wanted to change it, but actually you're coming up against the forces of the government, because the government are the ones who legislate your union into how relevant it is. So if that's the case, and if your union is essentially saying, well, the government says we can't do this or we can't do this, and you can't take strike action and stuff, then what do you do? And that's what my last interaction with my union was taking the piss out of it with a joke election campaign because it was so dreadful and ineffective. But the point becomes more important that if unions aren't working, what organisations can we form to support militant workers' actions, or even just workers getting better wages and stuff? And this is the other reason why I focus on community organising, because actually I think that's another route to working class power which hasn't been explored very well yet. Plan C is an organisation talking about the social strike in Birmingham a lot. And it's a really important thing, because if you have, let's say you're, from my position, working in a 0 hours contract in a cafe, I wouldn't be able to go on strike. I know for a fact that they can just get rid of me because I'm on a 0 hours contract. There's no negotiating power. I'd have to get every single other person in there who's also far too scared and apolitical to want to stand up. But if we had people outside of that organisation who were willing to come out and go, you don't have to risk your job in order to do this, but we'll stand here and we'll hand out and we'll damage the image of this place. We'll give out leaflets to people saying, don't use this company, they're using 0 hour stuff. You attack them on the smallest possible basis. Then the workers can actually feel confident that when they need you, you'll come. And they're not going to be isolated by themselves. And that's why I think the community organising needs to have a strategic element to it. It can't just be done for the sake of it. It has to be done with an idea of where you're going to take it afterwards. Now, it shouldn't be done in a kind of top-down, do this now, community. I've decided this is the best. But it should be done in a democratic position where you're able to argue, actually, these problems will be solved if we're able to apply ourselves properly, rather than just kind of doing nice things for the sake of it. Which is a bit of a cynical way of putting it, and I apologise, but that's how it feels to me sometimes. So yeah.
I think first of all about the media, I mean it's true that newspaper sales are declining, but yes, Rupert Murdoch still does have a lot of power, and so I would agree with the others that we need a combination of things. I mean, we need to, I think one, create or help with, sort of other alternative types of media organizations that can get other points of views across and are owned by Rupert Murdoch, But and I would also agree that social media is very useful as a tool, in terms of activism, but it does have its limitations, which you've pointed out. I mean, there's a book out there by Ella Carissa called The Filter Bubble, which is about that whole process where you only talk to people that that you already agree with. You only see the news that you agree with, and that sort of thing. And that I would argue. I mean, I'm speaking as someone who whinged a lot on Facebook after the election, for example. There are limitations to that, but then this is also what kind of takes to the second point about trade unions. I think where trade unions can be useful is that you are put in contact with a load of different people who aren't already your friends on Facebook. Maybe you can make them your friends on Facebook or whatever. But it's sort of like you can, because I feel like sometimes one of the criticisms I make actually of the past 5 years has been a tendency to stay within our our comfortable little activist subcultures a little bit. And so I think that where we all kind of share the same radical politics and that sort of thing, and that's fine too, but it's kind of not really enough. Now, in terms of trade unions, I don't really like the fact that we're talking about trade unions and community organizing like they're completely separate things. I think they can work together very well, in fact, and should be working together more. In terms of how I was able to, I think in terms of how things work, it was, I'll be honest, it was difficult. I did get a lot of resistance to trying to rebuild a plan. Thankfully, I was not the only one. There were a couple of others who were also doing the same thing, so I wasn't completely alone. I think when, in terms of advice, all I'd really say is, for one, don't let them, don't let them, just discourage you, because I think that, often when you're in a branch that's not active, there are often people who've been there for a very long time, and who are typically white, male, and over 50, not representative of membership. And not representative of the diversity of cities like this in particular. And so often what will happen is that, they'll be kind of sort of retreat into a kind of servicing model. The servicing model, is sort of the idea of unions as insurance rather than unions as active kind of social movement organizations. Which kind of became very prevalent in the kind of, the 90s and that sort of thing. So I would just say, don't let it, if you encounter this sort of stuff, to not let it stop you, to be persistent. Because what people like this really want is for you to go away, so they can kind of keep it as their own, keep things, nice and inactive. So, so I think to be persistent, I would say, but also to be imaginative, and to continue to contribute your ideas and creativity and energy. I mean, I think because unions don't have the best, reputation for being imaginative, but I do think again we need to be, if we're going to survive, and I think as well to really, I'd say to reach out to other people who might be interested. I would say, But I think sort of doing the combination of those things, but I think most importantly keeping at it. I think as well, I think talking to other people who are activists and find out how they've done it. So one of the things I found helped me was speaking to other people who are kind of active union reps, and I asked them a lot for advice about how they made it happen, and I found they were quite useful. But I had to say, I mean, in terms of the wages issue, I mean, that's really appalling, but it kind of doesn't surprise me, because I think what this government is trying to do, they're trying to create a situation where it's sort of like, it's like only certain people are allowed to have rights, really. And if you are an immigrant or if you're unemployed, you know, it is like you aren't really allowed to have rights. And so I think, and so in some ways taking away people's wages, you know, it does fit within. Of course, there is the irony about taxes, right? But it's like, it's the idea that, you know, if someone is undocumented, then they don't matter. They're not really a citizen. They're not really a human being. So we can get away with this. And but that sort of plays into that's the divisive rhetoric. And that's why I think, for one, you know, I think unions have a role in challenging these sorts of things. But I think we also do as a public. And again, it's to do with, you know, sort of making, when things like this happen, to call it out and you know, and to protest it, right? Because they get away with these sorts of things because people think it's not happening to me because I've got the right passport. You know, or I'm in a stable immigration situation, so I'm good. Those people are the bad ones, right? So I think it's really sort of publicly, visibly, sort of countering that sort of stuff, but also, you know, I think really working together to challenge these sorts of things, really.
I agree with everything that's just been said about trade unions, but I think also sometimes we forget our radical history. And we forget that 100, 120 years ago, before we had the vote, before we had the rights that we have now, people were organising in their unions and they were beginning to win things. I don't think we necessarily need to recreate things or create new things. We sometimes just need to remember how we did things before and try to build that back up again. We used to, you know, our forefathers and, you know, our ancestors had things that were really difficult to contend with, and we have rights now that they had to fight for, and we might need to fight again. This thing about the taking of wages, I think one of the things I take from it is that it shows us something about the Conservative Party that we can perhaps reflect upon and use to our advantage. They're an interesting mix, and we've already heard the word neoliberalism quite a lot tonight. And there is this desire within their party to spread neoliberal economics, the idea that there shouldn't be any borders for freedom of movement for capital, for money. And yet, the Conservative Party is also obsessed with nationalism and patriotism. And it is a schism within their thinking that actually will crop up time and time again in the next 5 years, whether it's about Europe, whether it's about immigration, or whatever. And it's a kind of a fault line that we can expose and use to our advantage. And I think that's something we just need to reflect upon. They're not purely a neoliberal party. They have this desire to keep Britain separate in some way. And we I'm assuming a lot of us like the idea of internationalism. We don't see these national borders as separating us. We want to embrace culture and diversity around the world. So they have a slightly different perspective on that. And I think that's going to be something that will be interesting as it develops in the next 5 years.
We're going to take the next round of questions because there were people who wanted to ask questions, and then we'll shift the discussion on. Yes, if you know.
Yeah.
I have a response, actually.
Well, can we get the questions first, and then you can get the response?
Okay, thanks very much. Mine is more of a comment. You know, I hope any of the panelists can maybe respond. Or, you know, do excuse me if I'm going a little bit off the topic, because I want to talk about something that is not purely, you know, Britain, relates to Britain, but about the outside world as well. For instance, where I come from, the sub-Saharan Africa. You know, my opinion about this whole thing is that the movement for social justice, the advocacy for social justice should try to think a little bit outward. You know, outward. Their thinking should be a little bit to other parts of the world, rather than just thinking about Britain. The reason why I'm saying this is that there are many things that are happening in other parts of the world, for instance in sub-Saharan Africa, which do impact what is happening in the British politics. The one important thing is the issue of immigration. And I think the issue of immigration is being utilized or used by the right to gain a lot more support, and as a result, they consolidate their power and make issues that the left is concerned with, the issues concerning the left, to be relegated to public policy, within the public policy, for example. One issue that I want, people to think about is leadership in sub-Saharan Africa, which is causing so much injustice, and as a result, so many of the youths in sub-Saharan Africa are forced outside. They take desperate measures, across the Mediterranean, trying to flee to come to Europe, and this is impacting the daily, life of the people here, and it must have had an impact on the last election that we have been talking about. So I think, in a way, we should, extend the advocacy to issues of social justice in other parts of, the world. How can we put pressure on the, leadership in sub-Saharan African countries, which are causing so much injustice to their people, and create, opportunities within their own countries. I'm not saying that because I think that I'm advocating for separation. It's not that. But I think because creating opportunities elsewhere, makes the world richer rather than, actually separating people. That's what I want to see.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a very good question. Thank you.
I'd like to make 2 points or comments if I could. The first is that everyone on the front table expressed surprise at the election results. And I have to say I was surprised. And to me it was very much deja vu all over again. It was very similar to 1992. Except in 1992 I actually wrote a very long letter in the New Statesman explaining why I expected that result. This time I wrote a very short thing in the Voice newspaper anticipating the results. And as Kehinde would know, there was a little exchange between a number of people about that issue. But the real point for me is, why are people on the top table surprised at the results? If you are surprised, then that should be saying something about the analysis that you were conducting in the run-up to the election. Because if you were conducting what I believe is correct analysis, then there shouldn't have been any surprise. The second thing which I would like to say relates to the unions. Of course, the unions can be benign, but they can also be malign. And I'm an academic, as it happens, and my experience of a union which has already figured in the discussion tonight, UCU, is that it is, as far as black people are concerned, a wholly malign force. And indeed, without going into too many details, I have actually been on the other side of a legal dispute with UCU, in which a large number of things came out, such as its absence of support of black members, what I perceive to be corruption at the top of the union, when it comes to racial matters, etc. I won't go into the details of that, but I would just like to make those points.
There's been a lot of talk about student movements and things like that. It's struck me that Danny Alexander got kicked out by a kid that hadn't done her final exams yet, and it struck me for quite a while that unless you're a hardworking family or a pensioner, we just happen to drive our house prices up, that there's really nothing in either of the manifestos for you apart from rising costs and diminishing employment prospects. So, over the next 5 years, if we're talking alternatives to the Tories, how realistic is it for there to be, say, a student independent candidate, because it strikes me that there's a very close by demographic that you can appeal to, or the student can appeal to, and what would be the hurdles in the way of that?
Cool, I think we've got a couple, two, yeah. We'll take them and then we'll go panel.
Yeah, I think we're just going to take these and come back to the panel.
Yeah, it's half past.
I'll just dive right in. I came here under the understanding that we were going to kind of formulate some kind of action plan, and I do have many ideas of how we can do that on a micro and a macro level. These people at the front have come here to talk about what they do and what we can do. Yeah, we all feel shit about what's gone on. Let's just move on and talk about solutions now. I think if you work with any minorities, you know that it's quite urgent. On a micro level, the whole neighbour thing, absolutely down with it. People have laughed with me about doing coffee mornings. Actually, just, excuse my language, but effing, invite your neighbours round for coffee and talk about what they want. I live on the loveliest street because we cook for each other. My neighbour Pauline tells me about benefits and about how to avoid bad men, which is great. Do you know what I mean? But the young people have got nowhere to go. They're actually very lonely and very scared because I actually saw one drop down on the ground by a policeman, and I actually had to go out and witness it and say, if anything comes of this, then you've got my number, and I took down the policeman's number. So it is on a micro level, yes, talk to your neighbours and see what can happen at a street level. On a macro level, because it is such a giant thing, there's something called open space events that are actually extremely effective. And I've chaired many activist groups, and none have been so effective as the open space event. If you do want to be a leader and you want to chair any kind of meeting, at the end, have action points and hold people accountable. It's all very well getting angry and talking, but this dude in the middle has it absolutely spot on, and, well, all of you, let's take direct action. And that is in the form of actually saying, what does my street want, listening to people. But when you meet with people, always end with action points, and then reconvene, take emails, take addresses, take actual addresses, because, things can collapse and, networks can come down. But the main thing is action points, hold people accountable, keep people linked up. So micro level, talk to your neighbours. Actually, my ideal vision is actually to have a community centre on every corner of every street, because old people feel on their own. I feel on my own. I'm a single mother. It's really hard to just meet with my friends. Not all of my friends want to go to a pub. Some of them are Muslim. Do you know what I mean? Actually, and it's actually really hard. I own my own business. I coach people. It's really hard to meet people in a free space, because all we can do is buy something and move on. So actually, creating free space could actually be in our own houses, which is very, very difficult as well, because we've been told to be fearful of anybody who is not our own selves. So that's all I wanted to say. It can be done, but can we just start talking about solutions instead of saying, you know, what are you talking about and getting to questionship? So in actual time, we do
That kind of prefigures where I'd like to shift the debate. Because I think one of the things we need to kind of shift from now is we kind of had our moment. But Birmingham, and that's the country, but Birmingham, because we're in Birmingham, right, is going to face 5 years of something, which is austerity. You could call it, you know, we can go from light austerity to the harsh austerity that we're going to face in the next 5 years. So we've been through a period, we're going to go through a period. I'd like the panel to reflect on what they think will be the key issue, or the key issues, plural, right? And how, what we can do. Let me shift this, and then we'll shift, because, yeah, you want to shift again?
I was actually going to provide a positive response to the response, actually, because I think it's incredibly transferable. I grew up in areas that were largely white, and my family, both extended and immediate, still live in areas that are in those areas in the countryside, where the majority of the votes have now, as we've seen, turned blue. So I think this kind of action, whereby it's feeding into what many of you are discussing in terms of not providing a viewpoint that people can easily dismiss because they feel threatened. And it's a means of just engaging a dialogue on a micro level that can be expanded upon. It's a good way to start, and thank you for raising it.
So I think that's where we want to shift the discussion about what are the issues facing Birmingham, what can we do locally, how does this get into national narratives. You know, for example, the concept of food is going to be a big issue in the next 5 years. People, we already know now, people cannot afford to feed themselves. All right? And it's about how we can move that discourse forward from a politics of survival to an actual politics that actually resists as well. So it's not just about food, but it's about nutritious food, and it's about how we get our food and distribute our food. Yeah. So I'd like the panel to reflect on that, and then we'll throw it back out to the audience, and then we'll wrap up. Is that okay? Yeah. Go for it.
Okay. Well, I'd like to start by talking about the issue of housing. I mean, I've seen this particularly in London, and I imagine that it will spread, and I'm sure there's been issues in Birmingham as well. We're seeing an increase in evictions, and I think we're going to see that continue. And I think if anybody wants to get involved with resisting this government, then what they can do is start finding out where people are under threat of facing eviction, and start to work with that community to try to ensure that people can stay in their homes. We're not just seeing people being thrown out of their homes, we're also seeing people being encouraged to move away from areas that they've been in for decades. We're seeing communities destroyed. And I don't think it's going to just remain a London thing. There are certain facets to the situation in London where capitalism is such that property is becoming a massive issue, and is becoming an issue where only the very rich can afford to live in London. But I think that it will spread to other areas. And what we don't want to see is people being told that they can no longer live in the places that they've always enjoyed living in. Very quickly what you see is the property prices rising, and then the traditional services and cafes and pubs going out of business and being replaced. You get gentrification, and you end up with a community that doesn't look like where you've lived all your life. And that's something that we need to rebel against. We need to join together with people across the community to ensure that when the bailiffs come, there are actually bodies between them and the people that are due to be evicted. And it can work, it can prevent it. And you know, what better way of showing solidarity than to stand in the street with other people and prevent them being removed from their communities.
Okay, well, I think two issues I think will be important, and I think in some ways, you know, maybe this is a bit of a segue, but in terms of housing, I mean, one of the reasons why the kind of property market has expanded so much is that people have been looking to rental income and that sort of thing to replace declining wages. You know, because you can, you know, people aren't able to save for a pension or they aren't earning enough, so they think, oh, I'll become a buy-to-let landlord, for example. So this is where some of these things are connected, you know, in terms of the housing bubble, and it's benefited, you know, certain generations more than others, as we've seen. But also the other thing is, the issues I think that will be important. But three I think are important, but I'll talk to two. But the three I think are benefits, precarious work, and I think I would say again sort of racism and xenophobia. I think those will be because I'm just thinking again of the kind of nasty rhetoric we're seeing from the government. Who will be the scapegoats? And so in terms of precarious work, I mean, I've kind of said some of this already, but I think that unions need to, you know, sort of, you know, in some ways, I think for people who are in precarious work situations, I think that unions need to do more to kind of involve people, so that people can actually feel that unions are organizations for them, and not only for people on permanent contracts. But I think as well, I think the whole issue of 0 hours contract is going to be a huge one. And I think one of the things I noticed just after the election was Ian Duncan Smith said he wanted to rename 0 hours contracts as flexible hours contracts. So would suggest that they want 0 hours contracts to be a normal part of working life. And so we also need to campaign against 0 hours contracts. I mean, there have been a lot of employers who say, well, some people like them. It's like, you know, are you joking? Do you have any idea what it's actually like to live in something like that? So I think as well, those who are on 0 hours contracts do need their voices heard. And you know, there need to be more personal testimonies about what it's like to live in them. But I think a lot of work needs to be done, and I think that unions have a lot of work to do, but I think there needs to be a broad-based campaign against them. But I think as well, you know, as we've heard, we've already heard a lot of, you know, quite kind of scapegoating rhetoric. I mean, part of it is the kind of anti-immigration thing, but I think as well people have brought up sort of, you know, the counter-terrorism bill, the kind of framing of you know, Muslims as particular as terrorists, and so I think that we need to. I think that's something that does need to be publicly challenged, and I think this needs to also be, you know, connected to a defense of civil liberties as well. But anyway, I feel like I've kind of, in terms of the what is to be done stuff, I mean, I feel like I feel like I was saying a lot what I was going to do before, so maybe I'll just hand it over.
Okay, yeah, so this is the thing I've been putting a lot of thought into myself, and I'm glad you raised the points that you did, because it's helped get me back on track of sort of what I wanted to say before. First things, like, where things are going to go bad at the moment, it's hard to say everywhere, but, you know, most areas really, unless you're very well off or like a wealthy business or something. I think, along with housing, I think like service degradation is going to be a huge issue, and that's going to feed into a lot of racism and xenophobia as well, because what we're going to see is public services getting cut, and then people going, this service is really inefficient, let's privatise it, because that'll make it more efficient. Then it turns even crapper, but then what happens is people start to go, that's the business's fault, it's not our fault for underfunding and like saying off all the resources of this. No, it's their fault. So it's a full delegation of responsibility, and we've got to keep an eye on who is responsible for doing all this stuff and making sure they're accountable for doing it, not the company or the local authority or whoever, who has very little ability to control what they do. I think racism is going to be a huge thing, to be honest. I think what's happening at the moment is as soon as any kind of like ethnic minority community start to self-organise, they're painted as radicals and terrorists and everything else that can possibly stand. And we're starting to see it creep onto the kind of left now a little bit. We're starting to see anarchists getting targeted as like extremists. Like, I've got to report you to the police apparently. I'm not probably doing that, but you know, like. And now white people are going to start feeling the tension of it, and I think like I can't imagine what it's like to have already been going through that all the time and seeing these stupid articles going on about such and such extremists while ignoring firebombs being put out the front of mosques. I think it's absolutely disgusting. I hate it, but it's going to get worse. So I think what we have to do is when we do our community building, we also start to do stuff like speak to churches, speak to mosques, speak to places of worship, speak to areas where people are congregating often. And what I'll say is, because of what I'm doing now, is a lot of this, we should. Right, I'm going to commit now to talk to my neighbour. I'm going to go and talk to them, like say, do you want to have a tea or coffee or something? I'm going to hate it because I'm antisocial, I don't like talking to people, but we have to do it. And all of us in here are probably feeling the same thing, like someone else would do it, I don't want to do it. Can you imagine going out your door right now, knocking on it?
It's like, what if they're horrible?
Yeah, well they're not more like me, so like, but we have to start thinking in these terms. All of us have to do it. It makes my stomach curdle thinking about going to speak to my neighbours, because I don't know why. I think it's because I'm British. But that's the first step, because if we can do that, then we can start talking to people in places of worship and stuff like that. Then we can start offering genuine solidarity that isn't just rhetoric, but is us turning up and doing stuff that makes people feel glad that they're human and there's other humans around and helping them. I think that's where we start. We start immediately applying it as much as possible. I would also say, join Left Unity, join Class War, join the Green Party, join something that's not really bad. Join your union. Join your union, definitely join your union. I mean, you don't have to worry too much about the dues. I keep forgetting to pay mine.
Sliding scale for based on income.
Well,
so if you're located, you don't have to pay a lot.
Exactly. Join your union as well. Find out what is relevant to you that can do something for you. It might be a different group, it might be an anarchist group, it might be the RGBW, it might be a weird Trotskyist group or something. Yeah, start your own group, even better, because that means that you're having an influence over how it goes. But try something now. A lot of us here are already doing stuff. I've seen faces I know who are already involved in a lot of different things. But I think a lot of us also don't quite have the confidence to go out there and say, I'll give this a go. Don't worry about if the group's bad, it doesn't matter, because you can choose another one. We all make mistakes, you know. But at the end of the day, you're not going to be tainted with it forever. But we are going to be tainted with it forever if we don't do something about this now. So join up and speak to people, and let's go and smash this shit. Yes.
What's the biggest issue facing Birmingham now? I mean, bluntly and nebulously, it's going to be austerity. It's going to be a city that's already been starved of funds over the last 4 years, being further starved of funds by a government it didn't vote for. And that's just going to worsen all the pre-existing conditions we've got here in Birmingham: deprivation, housing shortages, unemployment that goes back 20, 30 years. And that's really going to be the main bit of it. I just want to pick up gentrification, because that's, I think, going to be another big issue again in the next 5 years here. There was a story in the local press in the last few days about a investment consortium that's looking into moving into the Birmingham retail market, because apparently it offers greater returns than London does now. And colour me cynical, but I don't think they're going to be investing in affordable housing. It's going to be luxury flats, the same thing that's driven a lot of Londoners out of London. And that's going to happen here in our city, and I'm not overly keen on that. In terms of what can we do about local austerity, or indeed any of the issues facing Birmingham, it's going to be paying attention to what's happening in our local areas. It's going to be taking the fight to local places, local services, libraries, community centres, whatever they are, whatever's still left, basically. It's going to be taking the tedious and sort of unglamorous trudge through local bureaucracy, through local issues, and through local politics. I mean, it's perhaps not as exciting as global causes, or not as rousing, but it's the best we can do locally.
Just because I'm a student, I want to pick on some of the other questions that have been left unanswered. And there was a question about the student movement putting up a candidate. And all I'd like to say is that if you actually got involved with the student movement, you'd realise just what a complete utter headache it is. So you have the left, but it's completely divided, and everyone hates on each other. So there's no way everyone will be able to agree on one candidate. In fact, they'll probably put 10 candidates who have similar politics but will hate each other, and you're not going to achieve much. So yeah, that's something we need to work on. There was a question about the issues in sub-Saharan Africa, and one thing that actually, the hypocrisy of, European countries never ceases to amaze me, because you'll have, their colonial kind of interventions and destructions of these countries. In Libya, for example, we wanted to, bomb democracy into them, and now you've got Libyans trying to come over to Europe, but we're letting them die in the Mediterranean. So, there's various things, but in terms of how we can affect the leadership in Sub-Saharan Africa, we're trying to change the leadership here, so, one step at a time, hopefully. There's some questions about, the issues that affect in Birmingham. Everything that has been raised in terms of housing, food, the NHS, services, gentrification, all these issues affect black and minority ethnic communities the most. So, when you have, I come from Los Alamos, it's one of the most, economically deprived communities in the UK, as they put it. Our schools are underfunded, we have, terrible access to services. When you want to go to the GP, you have to give, you have to wait a week, and then you have to go in again to check if there's some free time, and on Mondays, there's a walk-in centre or something, and then you've got to go at 8:30 to grab the first slot. So if you think it's tough for some communities, BME communities have it even worse. And then you have communities that are trying to organise. So in Tower Hamlets, for example, you've got Rabina, who's running against a Labour candidate who refuses to acknowledge her existence as a Muslim woman, and in fact says that he calls her Lutfa Rahman's team. So you've got people who are willing to, stand up and represent their communities and fight austerity, but then you've got the same people that are supposed to be their allies, fighting against them. But I guess, there's a massive challenge, and what we have to do is literally work within the community, set up these movements, have these open space events that people are held accountable, because for far too long, our MPs have got away with literally murder. I know so many MPs I can name off the top of my head, and I'll get in trouble, so I wouldn't name them. But, we need to hold people accountable. People are on £70,000 wages a year, and they're literally voting through policy that, affects our communities with terrorism legislation, tuition fees, with services, privatisation. And the sooner that we can kind of, let go of these minor divides that kind of divide the left, the sooner we can kind of get on with it and sort this country out, because it's not going to change unless we actually put our foot down and do something soon, please.
I thought we were supposed to be addressing your. I didn't address it because I thought we were supposed to be speaking. Can I talk about it? Okay. Well, because I'm actually on the Black Members Standing Committee, and I mean I think because I'm framing this more in terms of what can we do. I think that's important. This is why it's important that Black people get involved. I would argue to be able to. I think to be able to challenge, that kind of. I'm trying to say this well. Unfortunately, this is, there has been unfortunately a history of institutional racism in the labour movement. Which I think as many people have also have challenged in many ways quite successfully. But I think one of the problems is that people think of race as a kind of equality issue, which is different from the industrial issues, right? And what we need is a situation where we think about these things as the same thing, right? But I think in order to do that, I think we need to get involved in the structures, to be able to meaningfully challenge any issues that we might see in the kind of leadership. I would say, because otherwise, if we don't do that, then they'll just get away with it. I would say, in terms of getting sort of legal support, I think it's a really complicated situation because, to be frank, the employment laws are not on our side. They're basically written by the employers. And often it's very difficult to get legal support in employment tribunals unless there's a 50% chance of winning, in terms of actually getting legal support. So we can have a longer debate about why that, kind of why that's the case, but I don't want to sort of bore you with sort of legal discussions. However, at the same time, I also hear what I agree with what John was saying before about the limitations of employment tribunals, because winning in an employment tribunal. It's not going to make your workplace any better, to be honest. And I know the way to make your workplace better is to collectively organize there, but also to organize in a way that involves Black people. That isn't just about. That isn't just about sort of unions being for, sort of tiny section of the workforce, right? So I think my argument is to get involved and also to continually bring up these issues, right? So that we actually do think about, that race issues and equality issues are important, and they're not to be sort of marginalized in the context of austerity, So that's, so I thought I'd sort of address that.
Okay. I can see a whole bunch of hands going up, but we're actually running. We gotta go, basically. So what I'm gonna do, right? Because I'm gonna wrap up the discussion, but you can speak to your neighbour after the event, okay? You can generally. One of the things we did bring this together for is that you could network after the event. So I'm gonna wrap up because they're gonna kick us out. So I would like to thank you for coming, and we thank the panel, please, for. I hope you can take this event as it facilitates some interaction, facilitates some networking, because it's going to be a long 5 years. So.
Yeah, but hey, we're up for it.
There you go. Yeah. Take care, people. Go home safe.